Hello and welcome to Day 5 of Gŵyl Festival. Firstly, I have a very exciting announcement that we're actually having to extend into Monday and Tuesday next week because people I didn't want to go over an hour's worth of content per day. I know that's already a lot for people to watch so here we go. Had too much content. We're extending. So I hope you'll stay with me all the way until Tuesday. I also, so first of all today I'm talking to Will Dawson, who is sort of the creative associate, he's decided to name himself, of the festival, and he is been a great help. He genuinely spends half of, 50% of his day on the phone for me. We are talking about The Plague by Camus, and I think it's an interesting chat. Then after Will, I have an interview with the one and only Dr. Julie Curtis, who wrote a biography of Yevgeny Zamiatin in addition to her, I think she has 2 biographies on Bulgakov, was it 3? Who in addition has written on Bulgakov and Master and Margarita Bulgakov. This book is a dystopian book that is hugely influential, and was, if you have read 1984 and love 1984, you should absolutely read Wye, because not only did he brace his structure on it, a lot of plot points, a lot of sort of philosophical questions that is looked at in that are explored in 1984, but they really have very similar trajectories of a book, and very similar. The one that always sort of struck me is that in 1984, much is made of Winston's escape in his time with Julia, is his where he feels free, and it's often linked to nature in the countryside, and he's going out and having sex in a field essentially, and that is very much was highly influenced by the presence of nature in here. I don't know if you can see, but basically the glass dome is used as a method of execution in the book, and then the city is literally enclosed by walls, and once you leave, and so the main character escapes the walls and outside sort of explores the green grass of the green grass, and the plants and the nature, and it's a symbolism of freedom in that too. So I think this was this talk was very informative, and is a particular interest of mine, and it was an absolute privilege to speak to her, and I can't believe I got it. Feel so lucky. So yeah, enjoy that one too. But first, Will and I talking about The Plague. It's recording. Hello and welcome back everybody to Gŵyl. This is the festival in translation, and boy oh boy do I have a special evening in store for you. I'd first of all like to introduce cultural critic and creative associate of the festival, Will Dawson.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Will's main role is to sort of push me when I get a bit scared, which he does excellently. So we're going to be talking tonight about Camus' The Plague, which very predictably we both bought because
maybe my least inspired reading choice ever.
Sales have skyrocketed very predictably. Full disclosure, I got to page 84 and I was really convinced Will wasn't going to enjoy it, so I told him he'd already purchased it, but I was like, no, I don't think this is going to be your cup of tea, and I bailed on page 84, but Will really loved it, and it turned into one of his favourite books of the moment. So just tell me a little bit about why you wanted to pick The Plague and talk about The Plague.
Reason behind wanting to pick The Plague, I think, is fairly obvious. I think one thing, interestingly, that this festival has done is actually opened a gap in my reading. I realised that actually I haven't read a lot of translated fiction, and in a sort of roundabout way, that's quite nice to know. But I think the combination of being in the situation with coronavirus and having recently read it, that's my reason behind picking it to speak about with you. I think the reason I enjoyed it, I mean, as with any book, there are many. One thing that struck me throughout was how strong it reads as a novel, as well as a kind of, I mean, he rejected being called a philosopher, but as a kind of philosophical discourse or absurdist discourse. And I found that really pleasantly surprising. I've never read any Camus before this, apart from The Outsider. And I think, you know, too long ago and too young to really be able to kind of grapple with it. So this I would kind of consider to be my first encounter. And I think I must have brought in some kind of prior bias that it was going to be a kind of deeply philosophical novel, which it is, but actually I think as well it is a really good standalone novel. On top of that, obviously the philosophical points are really interesting in terms of sort of responsibility, in terms of various allegorical meanings for the plague. It's a book that lets you apply the plague to maybe whatever you want it to. It provides a really nice framework for thinking about things like hope, responsibility, and those kinds of discussions. And it's beautifully written. My sister studies French, and we've been speaking about him a lot, and actually she doesn't believe that he translates particularly well, which I think is interesting, given how still I found it a really beautiful book to read. So yeah, I mean, just sort of as well being surrounded by the situation with coronavirus now, I think it articulated an awful lot of things that we've all felt. Yeah.
What were some of those parallels that you felt were articulated and that you weren't seeing elsewhere?
So it's not that I haven't seen them elsewhere because they don't exist elsewhere. It's more sort of a gap in my reading as such. But it's things to do with loneliness and the way in which we are all dealing with things like separation. I think the word they most commonly use in translation is exile, and that kind of separation from both public life but also from loved ones, and the kind of all of a sudden the lack of tenderness that we have in our lives, and you go from having intimate relationships with loved one or family member through to actually being, you know, alone without your partner. In the book, Ryu's wife is sent away to a kind of hospital or care home, so he's separated from her. People are separated from their loved ones. One of the main characters, a journalist who is in the town by kind of chance, essentially, is separated from his partner and tries on multiple occasions to escape. And I think that's where his whole kind of obsession with absurdity comes in that these things do just happen by chance, and that tenderness and that intimacy is taken away so quickly. So that's something that I found really interesting, his discussion of what do we become when we're denied that. And I've forgotten your question.
It doesn't matter. It's the parallels between the book and the current situation. Like, obviously,
yeah, absolutely.
And it's isolation and the lockdown. And so in the book, the central characters are all enclosed in a town. So it's actually am I right in saying it's a cholera epidemic that's being described?
It is actually the bubonic plague. Well, actually, I tell a lie. It's not the bubonic plague. It shows signs of being bubonic plague, but I think it's never actually fully established if it is the bubonic plague. But it's referred to throughout as the pestilence or the plague.
I correct myself. It's based on his experiences, I think, of cholera. I think that's
And that's quite interesting as well, in that he was isolating actually in Iran because he was ill himself, and then he was sent away to France to recover. And at that time, that was when the Nazi occupation of France took place. But his wife and his mother were both still in Algeria. And so he was separated from them because obviously he couldn't leave the country and they couldn't get into the country. And so as an individual, he went through this exile and through also this physical ill health, but is then sort of, I suppose, filtering that onto an entire town. So much of what he writes about is actually indirectly autobiographical, which is, I think, why there are so many things that when we read them now feel almost prophetic. But actually that understanding isn't chance, it's personal. And that's also quite interesting to think of someone who can understand collective suffering through only having experienced collective suffering of an illness, and transporting that onto a town of people, obviously being in Nazi-occupied France. But that's another interesting thing as well, is that I think the novel is thought of as being a kind of, especially when it came out, which was I think a few months or a few years after the Nazi occupation ended, it's thought of being an allegorical novel about Nazi occupation of France. But as I said earlier, I think I'd say there are two things. So firstly, I think you can actually easily make a case for it being colonial occupation, something about the way in which obviously France was occupied by the Nazis, but also colonized much of North Africa down into Mali and other sort of, Ivory Coast and so on. But also Taru, one of the characters, talks, he has a kind of soliloquy or monologue in, I think, part 4, where he's talking about actually we all carry a plague within us, and that kind of personal plague. And it allows you, like I say, to take this idea of the plague and apply it to, I've seen it applied to Nazi occupation, to colonialism, but also to late capitalism, right? You can apply it wherever you want.
It's the perfect metaphor, isn't it? A plague can be and it is commonly used in our colloquial language. A plague on both your houses. A plague is a really common metaphor that we use all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And as a result, that makes his discussion of responsibility that much more interesting, because we are constantly going through a plague, no matter what the circumstances are, be it societal or be it individual. The very kind of detached logic that he uses, I think the quote is that the only way to fight the plague is through decency. And he uses the image of a schoolmaster talking about how 2 and 2 equals 4. And it's kind of cold, hard logic that he uses to justify his reasoning, I suppose, that responding to a plague, be it through one of these health teams or being through a doctor or being through, depending on the plague, kind of having that decent response and
there was a quote, you mentioned the doctor, there was a quote that you highlighted in a different chat with me about the doctor respond. I thought that was really interesting. Do you know what I'm on about? Where the docs say, so the doctor is confronted about why is he acting, essentially, that he is, I'll let you.
I think I know what you're talking about, where I think, again, it's a conversation with Taru, who's essentially outlining that, being a doctor, you always lose. The only thing that we all have in common is that we all die. And I think he's essentially asking the question, do you not constantly feel like a failure? And I think, is that failure not kind of compounded by a plague? The death rate is higher than usual anyway. And his kind of justification is, I think, the alleviation of suffering and pride, actually. These things are logical, or they're at least presented as being logical. There's a plague going on. What do? You fight it. Why? It doesn't take heroism. One of the characters is just a kind of civil servant who is not at all heroic, and yet does his bit to sort of create graphs and charts and to track statistics and to present those to the doctor. You know, he's not out there on the front lines, but he's putting his skills to their best use. He's not a hero, but actually without him, it's going to be more of a struggle to fight the plague.
That's very prophetic, isn't it?
Absolutely.
In terms of reading experience, what was your reading experience going through it? Like, how was it? Like for me, I think the reason I stopped at page 84 is I was just sort of struggling with it. I was finding it a little bit slow, and then I was sort of, you know, it was just a bit like, oh, well, do you know what? I'd like to read something fun at the moment. What?
Absolutely. I think, you know, I've read this. I'm currently on leave, furloughed, so I have a lot of time, so I can push through those kind of slower passages, and there definitely are slower passages. There are much more. There are pieces that feel much more involved with the novel, and pieces that feel much more involved with the philosophical aspects. And I think I found certainly that the pieces involved with the philosophy were took me much longer to get through. I had to reread them several times. But in that sense, I suppose I found them all the more gratifying. Would I be able to come home from work and pick that up and have a go at it? You know, absolutely not. Not to say that others couldn't, but that's not what I'm looking for from a book before bed. But I think I was consistently pleased and really enjoyed by, actually, like I say, just the beauty of the writing. He tracks and communicates changes of emotion using things like light and wind and these very natural elements really, really well. And I've just picked up The Stranger, and he already does the same thing, and he goes on to do it sort of throughout the novel. And, you know, the reason being that he kills the Arab being because the sun was so fierce in the sky.
Yeah.
And his use of light and writing about light is really excellent and enjoyable. And I don't think that you need to search for metaphor or allegory. You just need to enjoy those bits. You know, he's a great writer of natural occurrence.
Do you think that I entirely agree. I just entirely agree. The Stranger is one of the best books. Do you think that he structured it this way for a particular reason? Like, what do you get from the structure of it?
If I'm honest, I haven't got a sort of wholesale answer to that. I think in the same way that you would structure, say, an essay, you have your introduction, you have your discussion, you have your conclusion, loosely. And it is very much like that in terms of, you know, at the end of part 1 is declare a state of plague, stop, close the town, is the telegram. You know, right from the start, where we've just had rats dying in the streets, and then you move on, and then part 3, I believe it is quite short, and he actually announces that it's an interlude, or maybe it's the start of part 2. He announces that there's going to be an interlude to acknowledge certain things that haven't yet need to be acknowledged, but that do need to be acknowledged. So it might have actually been a tool that helps him write it in that sense, as much as it is for us to read it. But the arc is very obvious from the parts. Yeah. If anything as well, I mean, I find things like chapters and parts quite useful when reading. Not that I give myself a deadline or something, but sort of I have an idea, like I'd like to read part 2 and 3 today or something. You know, those set in stone marks that are put there by the writer, I allow myself to use them. I think they're there to be used.
Yeah. Is there anything in particular that you really wanted to touch on that we haven't looked at already?
I think 2 things that I think are quite linked. And firstly is I rarely have read a book that's like I've asked so many questions about. And I think that the questions that it asks around things like justice and responsibility can be answered by yourself I don't necessarily think it's a book that you need to read around an awful lot. That's one of the nice things about the plague being identifiable with anything, is that you can put your own personal meaning there. It's almost the reverse of what he did. So I like that. But one particular thing I've been thinking about is the idea of hope. We're living in a time that is maybe devoid of hope for whatever reason.
Wow, you're so insightful.
I don't think that is insightful. I think
no, that's exactly what I mean. I'm not sure that is insightful either.
No, not at all. But the whole idea around, hope and setting yourself up for a fall, and the kind of blind nothingness that causes a plague to happen, is quite interesting. And should we allow ourselves to hope? And that's where I don't think Camus believes in hope.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I know he doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And that's got me questioning my own relationship with hope.
You can say
I have a relationship with hope, but it's just, you can see the cogs whirring about, should I be as hopeful as I am? How do you approach a situation where you feel like hope might get you through? Is hope actually practical? Is hope the best way to spend our time? Nothing else has made me think about that in any other way. So, I think, and responsibility as well. And I think of myself as being very, if not irresponsible, then certainly someone who shies from it. But actually, if responsibility comes from decency, and decency is something that we all have within us, and it's all reachable, then all of a sudden being responsible feels an awful lot less scary. If you can substitute responsibility for decency, if you can define responsibility as doing the decent thing, then actually that's not scary. I try to evade responsibility, but I try to do the decent thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lovely note. Is there anything to add about the translation in particular? When you're asking your sister, did she have anything in particular to add?
So we spoke actually a lot more about the stranger or the outsider, and because that is written.
If anyone doesn't know, that there's a sort of, the way Camus' books are written, there's a trilogy of fiction that corresponds to a trilogy of non-fiction, and the trilogy of fiction, just in case anyone was asked, couldn't find this on the internet somehow, is The Plague, The Fall, and The Outsider.
Yeah. So we spoke a lot more about that, and that is written in the imperfect and perfect tense. And a lot of French fiction is written, or the vast majority is written, in the past historic. And so by writing the stranger in the perfect and imperfect, it adds to this idea of the absurd as being a rejection of social norms. And that kind of side of things as well. And I think he was sort of, a radical thinker, and I think that was quite a radical thing to do. So in terms of translation, I actually think that it doesn't necessarily translate very well, because you lose that, and she doesn't think that Camus translates well, because you lose that, and that comes as well, I think, with a degree of kind of cultural knowledge. So you might not realise what it is that you're losing. Then the other thing I think to speak about in terms of the way it's written is this idea of, in French, it is called l'écriture blanche, which I think we would translate as being something along the lines of blank verse, although that makes it sound more poetic. It was coined by Barthes, I think, Roland Barthes, and he was talking, it's like a journalistic style of writing. And objectivity is actually something that I think Camus goes for quite a lot in The Plague, in that he keeps the narrator a secret, and he actually explains that, the narrator is revealed right at the end. he explains that the reason he's done it is to provide something of a historical account and not something that is bound up with emotion and bound up with kind of subjectivity. And that in itself, I think, links to those conversations around, logic for 2 + 2 = 4, and the best way in which to get something across in a logical manner without the kind of involvement of human emotion.
So when you say that, my first impression is to react quite negatively, because I think that a lot of times when people are asked to cut out emotion, it's men speaking to women to cut out emotion from their tales and things like that. And in dystopian fiction, I have a real issue with sort of how often historically you had men narrating, and you sort of get just because dystopian fiction I know quite a bit about, that tends to be certain narratives that dominate, like the man versus the state, that don't dominate when women write dystopian fiction, like for example Margaret Atwood and The Handmaid's Tale, that happens in a really domestic space. So in the same way, do you think that it is very, obviously it is of Camus that he wrote it, but do you think that that maybe limits it, or do you think that this is just one complementary story to a whole?
Limited in the sense that there isn't much descriptive.
Well, limited that you can cut out emotions. Is it a good thing that he cut out emotions, or actually could we gain something from seeing that emotion? Maybe this isn't the story.
I don't necessarily think that emotion is cut out of the story. I think that emotion is cut out of the narrator. So when you read it, you certainly feel things. There are long descriptions. There's a long description of one of the characters' young children dying. And that is a very emotive passage, and you feel emotion as a reader. The idea is not to read it, or at least I don't think the idea is to read it as a kind of, and to feel nothing. I think, and correct me if I'm missing the point here, because I somewhat feel that I am.
No, I don't think so.
But I think I want to say that when you read something objective, or that reads objectively, you are that much more inclined to believe it. And that by going for a more objective voice, he's trying to impress the truth. Maybe it's a bit sly, because obviously absurdism and existentialism, these things are opinions and so on. But I don't think it's a story that lacks emotion. I think the way in which he provides emotion is just not through the
I think this ties back quite nicely, right? In that, like, essentially what I was getting at is that is this one, obviously it's just his story, and there are other stories out there that are complementary narratives. But I guess my question, not necessarily to you, but my question to us as readers, and what we like seek to do in our reading, is to choose to complement those narratives, so that sort of like this is Camus' truth and this is Camus' narrative, but that those have to be complemented by other people's, in particular, voices that aren't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to take it as gospel and to subscribe to the absurd would be a weird life. No, absolutely. Obviously, you need to supplement it with kind of other readings, and to take it as kind of objective truth is. I don't necessarily think that his theory. I think you can draw from it. I think to take from it entirely is quite. That would be brave, and I think you'd be quite lonely. Yeah. No, absolutely. And actually, the discussion of gender is a short one with this book. That is something to note as well. is that there are two women of significance to the plot, and then maybe a third of no significance to the plot. And it is that, as you were saying earlier, it's not man versus state. It's, I suppose, at its fundamental, it's man versus life, man versus nature.
There's this understanding of precariousness, isn't there? So there's, I think her name is Isabella Lovey, and she's writing a really interesting book I would recommend, published by Verso Books, that is all about the instability of work, and it's something I'm really interested in. But she defines precarity on sort of these three different levels, and your very starting definition of precarity is kind of the level on which we're all equal. We're all equally vulnerable to a plague. We're all equally human and die, and these kinds of situations in which we're equal. And then the next level of precarity is the ways in which people have changed and taken resources and changed power dynamics so as to make that themselves safer. So the people in power want to sort of protect themselves from this fundamental level of precarity, and I think that's maybe what you were talking about.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Nothing more to add. When you're reading.
Would you like to say anything to conclude about the plague? No. Well, there we go. Thank you very much, Will.
Round of very much for having me. Thank you. Yeah.
No, and Will has been like a really great help during this time, setting up this festival. So I'm sure you'll be seeing more of him.
Thank you very much. I'm sure if you watch the time-lapse video, you'll conclude otherwise.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Will. I really enjoyed speaking to you about that, as I enjoy speaking to you about many books. Next we have the wonderful Julie Curtis. She is a doctor, a fellow at Wilson College, Oxford, and a professor of Russian literature, and I am in awe of her. Okay. Hello everybody, and welcome to another evening at Gŵyl Festival. Tonight, I have to say, no bias to anyone else, but this is the talk I've been most excited for myself, because it's a little bit of my academic background is looking at dystopian fiction, and this book, I don't have a copy with me, but I do have a chalkboard. We by Yevgeny Zamiatin is an often overlooked book that highly influenced 1984, and also I think he denied it, but influenced Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. With me tonight, I have Dr. Julie Curtis, who is Professor of Russian Literature and Fellow of Wilson College, Oxford. Thank you so much for joining me, Julie.
It's always a pleasure to talk about Zamiatin.
So, how did you start researching Zamiatin, and was this a long book? She's author of the book, The Englishman from Lebedyan. Is that how you say it?
Lebedyan, yes.
Not at all how I said it then.
Not so easy to say.
Where did your process begin?
Well, I had actually read Zamiatin and his close friend Bulgakov as when I was an undergraduate studying Russian, and they were both authors who I found really fascinating. And in the end, I embarked on a whole lot of research on Bulgakov primarily, who's very well known for the novel The Master and Margarita. But Zamiatin was always in the back of my mind, and when I had a period of sabbatical leave from my teaching job, I sort of looked around, and this was in the late 1990s. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and various opportunities for getting into archives were beginning to become much easier. And when I thought about it, I realized that there really wasn't a biography of Zamiatin. Zamiatin was born in 1884 and died in 1937. So you'd think that this was something that had been tackled before. but within the Soviet Union, Zamiatin, who emigrated to Paris in 1931, became a non-person, and he wasn't mentioned, and it wasn't possible to write about him for decades and decades after his death. And so that was one reason, was that it was a timely thing that needed doing. And the other thing was that Zamiatin was somebody who had spent some time in Britain. He spent 18 months in Newcastle on Tyne during the First World War, because he'd been trained as a naval architect, and I was actually sent by the Russian government to supervise the construction of icebreakers in Newcastle. So there's a British part of his life. And then in 1931, he emigrated and ended up in Paris, where he stayed until his death in 1937. And I speak French as well as Russian, and therefore that put me in a very good position to not only get access to archives in the relevant places, but really try and do research to understand these contexts. And so I embarked on this biography, which took me a very long time to write. And it only came out in 2013 with an American publisher. And it's still the only full biography of Zamiatin. There isn't one in Russian, which covers the whole of his life yet. So, and so, in fact, I mentioned to you that I'm very pleased at the moment it's actually being translated into Russian, and it should be coming out in the next month or so in Russia as well.
That's so exciting. What has the process been like for having your own book translated?
It's quite complicated and it's very strange. One of the things that you learn is that what you think is as your entirely lucid English turns out to be really complicated and tortuous. And but actually, I ran a tiny competition. I just advertised it locally in my university, inviting people to have a go at translating a couple of paragraphs, and sort of went with my instinct, with the person who not only clearly understood what I was saying properly, but somehow had a voice which worked. And so we worked closely together over a period of about a year. She's called Yulia Savikovskaya, and she was somebody I'd met actually. We'd done a lot of projects on, another of my research interests is Russian drama, and we'd done a lot of work together on various things, and so I'd got to know her. And she was very reliable and very good, and so there was an exchange. She would send me a first draft, and I would respond, and realize that there were some things that I wasn't confident about, and she knew a much better way of saying something than I had realized. So I learned quite a lot about it. And then actually since then, it's been edited again by the publishing house which is the Russian branch of the American publisher. And so there's been more input from them as well. So yeah, it's taken, well, a year and a half to get to this point. But as I say, I'm in the middle of the proofs at the moment, so that's quite a strange task. But it is odd to read one's voice in another language, especially working on proofs, because I'm actually staring with great attention at every word to make sure that it's exactly right. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, quite a surreal experience, not one that people have every day.
No, and I can't quite imagine. I mean, there are two issues. One of them is what my voice will sound like in Russian. It's absolutely not a Russian academic voice. It's neither as formal as some of the sort of most highbrow writing, but it's also not as subjective as quite a lot of biographical writing is in Russian. So I don't know. I don't necessarily expect it to be well received, but I know it's a useful document in the sense that if you're writing a first biography, although it's now become a little bit fashionable to sort of look down on cradle to grave biographies, in a sense, somebody's got to do the first one. Somebody's got to actually lay out, what was happening when, and the sequence, and actually it does, that sort of chronological approach sort of throws up some quite interesting issues. So on the one hand, I can establish that on the day when he wrote his most furious and bitter letter to his wife, when he was in England and she was refusing to come and join him, he also started a certain story on that, literally on the same day. And one can see echoes and connections. That's just a sort of coincidence. But one can also, through the chronological process, sort of work out reasonably important things, as, for example, the date of the completion of his most famous novel, Wye. Almost all the literature that has been written about it uses a particular memoir where somebody says, in the summer of 1921, Zamiatin was polishing off his novel. And it's only when you look at the chronology that it becomes perfectly clear from all the surrounding details that it could not possibly be 1921. It must have been 1920 or possibly even 1919. So you can actually establish some fairly fundamental things, like what is the date of when this book was written, by doing this sort of very scrupulous run through of dates. So anyway, I think it'll be of use to some people who want to sort of then do other more adventurous things.
The biography is available through open access, so I will link it below for anyone who wants to read it, because I really it was really interesting, because I never looked too deeply into sort of how he came to write, because that wasn't the focus of anything I was working on, and it was so interesting. In particular, I will bring them up later, but those quotes from Orwell in your conclusion were so telling. So I just wanted, before we move on, to talk a bit about your process of writing the biography, because did you have any adventures or anything that came up that was unexpected whilst writing it?
Well, I did have one extraordinary experience, which is sort of what an academic rather dreams of, and it doesn't often happen, which was that for various reasons, a lot of Zamiatin's archives are not only in Russia and in France, where he lived for a long time, but many of them ended up in different parts of America. So I used about half a dozen different American archives. And one day I was in Princeton looking at a very small collection of correspondence, and the man who brought the letters to me said, Zamiatin, I've just moved here from Albany, which is upstate New York, it's the state capital of New York. We've got Zamiatin up there. We got some, and it hadn't come up on any of the catalogues and things. So I literally got on a small plane and went up to Albany to see what they'd got, and took the lid off the box. And there was the typescript of his most famous novel in Russian, the original typescript, which is the only extant source material anywhere in the world for this text.
Chills. Like, I've got goosebumps now even thinking about that.
Jaw-dropping moment. It had, even for complete authenticity, one page missing, and because the novel had a very, very complicated publication history. He essentially completed it in about 1920, but it wasn't published in Russia until 1988. So 68, nearly 70 years after it was written, it first was published, as of course a lot of dissident and satirical and subversive literature was, as the Soviet Union came to an end in the era of glasnost. And when they published it in Russia, the only source they could use was an American emigre publication in 1952. And they literally just had to copy that text,
wow.
because it was the only text in Russian. It was the only source. And although it's fantastic that it was published in 1952, it was a very untidy publication in the sense there are actually some unfinished sentences and things. So we actually really did need an original text of the book. And so that didn't, it was one of the reasons why the biography took so long, is that I swerved sideways. And I have a wonderful colleague in St. Petersburg called Marina Lyubimova, who's a wonderful Zamiatin expert. And she and I produced, in fact, I can show it to you if you like. This is the authorized copy, edition of the novel Wye in Russia, which came out in 2011, edited by me and Marina. So this is it. This is what it looks like in Russia.
Oh, that is just, what a find.
It was extraordinary. And in fact, in that same collection where the box was, there were also 35 really important letters that he'd written to cover the period, particularly in Paris, about which we knew least of all. So that was another publication, and a very useful resource for the biography. But it doesn't often happen that you stumble across something in this way.
Did you know immediately what it was, or was it sort of like a slow realization?
Well, I had to go away and check, but only as far as I knew. And I actually then went to a conference in St. Petersburg a year later and said, by the way, I found a TypeScript. And they went, ooh, they all came rushing around to find out about it. But that's why, I mean, obviously it needed to be presented by a respected Russian scholar, because she was able to provide far more background. And it's one of the sort of paradoxes of having been a specialist on Russian literature and on 20th century Russian literature living in the West, and of my generation. In other words, when I started going, it was still the Soviet Union. And when I was a graduate student, it was still the Soviet Union. Is that one has to be humbly aware that as a Westerner, you had massive access to not only to archives, but also to publishing opportunities, which meant that it's possible to do these fairly fundamental tasks like writing the first biography, or producing the scholarly edition, or publishing somebody's correspondence, which in any normal open society would be done by the native scholars. I mean, it's really whose scholarship is far deeper and broader than mine. So I'm very conscious that I'm offering a slightly amateurish outsider contribution, but for the moment, even now, there are still some things that it's possible to do simply by virtue of living in the West and being freer to travel and having more money to do that sort of thing. But the Russian scholarship is terrific, but it does sometimes is a bit limited by lack of awareness. It's very odd with Zamiatin, for example, given that the novel was only published in 1988 and it was only possible really to start talking about him then. There are many, many, many doctorates and books written in the West about Zamiatin long before the Russians have been able to write about him themselves. He's now become a classic. He's on all their university and school syllabuses and so on. But one of the things I contributed to this edition was simply a survey of Western scholarship, just to say, well, there are these studies out there. So if you want to think about the imagery, or if you want to talk about some of the ideas behind it, then there are existing articles in English or French or whatever, which one could look at.
If you had to sum up Zamiatin's importance, also, sorry, side note, when I was doing it, I was spelling Zamiatin with a Y. Is that incorrect? Because I noticed you use an I.
It really doesn't matter. There are different transliteration schemes, and in each one is equally valid. I get slightly muddled because different publishers turn out to have different transliteration schemes, and as soon as you've sort of adopted one, you then have to unlearn it and learn another one. So it's completely unimportant. But yeah.
Okay, that's good to hear. So if you had to sum up why he's important and what his biggest not his biggest, how he has influenced in particular the world of dystopian literature, I think you have a really beautiful sentence in your book where you feel like he is the bridge between so the history of dystopian fiction comes from utopian fiction and there's a reaction to it, and that H.G. Wells is obviously the big author of the start of dystopian fiction, and that Zamiatin is this bridge between H.G. Wells and Orwell and Huxley.
Yes, I mean that's not my idea. The very, very good scholar and translator called Michael Glennie, I think, is the person who I'm quoting Michael Glennie when I mentioned that. But it does make very good sense to me because H.G. Wells obviously is we think of as a sort of father figure of science fiction, and it's particularly focused on the science. I think H.G. Wells is really fascinated by the potential of science to transform lives. And Zamiatin was an English speaker. he learnt English while he was studying. He didn't learn it at school, but he learnt it while he was studying in his courses in St. Petersburg as a naval architect. But he then spent 18 months in the northeast of England. And when he came back in the 1920s to Soviet Russia, there was a sort of visionary project led by Maxim Gorky called World Literature, in which the idea was that you would translate progressive works or works of interest from all across the world. And Zamiatin was chosen as one of the couple of people who would be responsible for the English section because of their fluency in the language. And so Zamiatin did actually edit a great many of the translations of H.G. Wells. He didn't tend to do the translations himself, but he wrote the introductions and organized it all. So he was absolutely immersed in H.G. Wells. I have to say that most of that work, I mean, he also received H.G. Wells when H.G. Wells came to visit the Soviet Union in 1919. But my view is that by that time he'd more or less finished writing the first draft of We. So it's not that I think the text is directly influenced by the H.G. Wells, but he would certainly be. I mean, the Russians were very well read, and they knew these texts. And then the novel We wasn't, as I say, not published in Russia. It was banned, but it did find its way out to the West, and it was published in Czech. It was published in English, and not a very good translation in America, and it was published in French. And actually the French translation is something that Aldous Huxley could have seen, because Aldous Huxley wrote Brave New World when he was living in France. And the French translation of Zamiatin's We, under the title Nous Autres, came out in 1929, and Huxley published Brave New World in 1932. I don't think it matters terribly that, Huxley said he hadn't read it, and I don't think you have to have read something. You can pick up ideas that are floating around. But actually, we do know. I was very grateful to a colleague who's a Huxley specialist here in Oxford, who was able to help me track down an article that Huxley wrote in 1932 or 3, I think, in which he talked about Zamiatin. So he certainly knew about Zamiatin as an essayist. So he talked about him being, in fact, I think Huxley said the Russians are capable of being the greatest prophets at the moment. So yes, there's a sort of Anglo-Russian conversation going on. And then the story with Orwell is that during the war, Orwell read a book about contemporary Russian literature and met its author. And he told him that he was very interested to hear about Zamiatin because he himself had been thinking about a book along these lines and was already taking notes for it. And this is 1944, but it's what would become 1984 itself. And what's very striking is that George Orwell, who was already quite beginning to be ill and would become very ill, writes 1984 between, I think, about 1946 and 48. And during that time, he writes at least 9 letters to publishers and to this Russian colleague who he'd met to try and get a new translation. He insisted that it was a really important book, that it was a better book than Huxley's, that it was a book that people needed to read. And so, in fact, it was George Orwell who retrieved Zamiatin's reputation, because Zamiatin had died and people hardly knew about him, and none of the translations had really made a big impact. And it was George Orwell and then this American professor, Russian, who went on to become a professor in America, who between them made sure that the book was retrieved. And I think a book which was read, it was not very well translated, it didn't make a huge impact certainly in the author's lifetime or even immediately afterwards, proved after the Second World War to have been extraordinarily prophetic. So, I mean, we could go and talk a bit more about what the novel itself has to say, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. This was the bit, just what you were speaking about is the bit that excited me most, learning how much Orwell championed this book.
Yeah.
I think that's just a lovely way of thinking about it. And that Orwell, there are so many similarities, and that Orwell was really open and like, this was, I think that's wonderful. So the book itself is structured into time log, like diary entries, and they describe D-503 and this one state world that has obvious parallels to the Soviet Union. It's very grey. I mean, maybe I should let you continue.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's interesting that the links between the Orwell and the Zamiatin are on all sorts of levels, including the fact of a diary, which the unwitting protagonist starts writing, but of course it's a fatal mistake because it's going to reveal his thoughts not only to us, the reader, but also to the authorities in due course. There's also a really fundamental way in which both texts are alike, in that neither of them are, in fact, I would argue, specifically directed against a particular state. I mean, Orwell said when he was asked that he was equally preoccupied with the dangers of fascism in Germany, Nazi fascism and Soviet communism, and he had set it in England because nobody should delude themselves in thinking that we were somehow special, that we weren't capable of succumbing to the same dangers. So that his own vision of 1984 was that it was a book with universal significance and not a particular political satire on one regime. It's not an anti-Soviet book. And although Zamiatin's Wye was banned by the Soviet authorities and assumed to be anti-Soviet, there are two things which make that far from obvious when you think about it. One of them is that if it's written in, as I would argue, 1919, 1920, it doesn't really matter, because what we need to remember is that after the two revolutions in 1917, which came after 3 years of First World War, Russia is then plunged into civil war. The Bolshevik coup of 1917 is only the beginning of their seizure of power, and the country is enduring civil war until 1921. In other words, this book is written in the middle of a civil war going on. The Allies, including the British, blockaded supplies. There was starvation. People lived in terrible conditions. The country was absolutely wrecked, and there was fighting going on, and so on. This is not the squeaky clean vision of a fully developed totalitarian society. It absolutely was not what Zamiatin could see all around him. It was certainly anticipated in Bolshevik propaganda about what might happen in the future, but it wasn't a depiction of what was happening around him now. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, let me just come back to Zamiatin's experience in England. This relationship between Britain and Russia was a very long established one, between the Northeast, the shipbuilding and so on. And Newcastle was the most advanced place for building icebreakers at the time. And icebreakers were really crucial for the Allies to keep contact because the Germans were blocking the Baltic. It's difficult to imagine just how important Newcastle was at that time, the time that they produced during the First World War something like, they launched one vessel a week during the First World War. It was a massive workforce across the various shipyards, very international, very controlled, because the authorities were very anxious. Many of the workers were foreign nationals, and they might either be industrial spies or subversives. So it was a highly industrialized, highly controlled environment, using all those things which had been developed, say, by Henry Ford, or those ideas, F.W. Taylor, so conveyor belts, production lines, or time and motion studies. So it was the cutting edge of technology in its time, and it was controlled like a police state. And its international significance is marked by the fact that at the end of the First World War, there were 23 consulates in Newcastle.
Wow.
From 1916 through until the autumn of 1917. And he then starts writing this novel within a year or two. So it seems to me he's absolutely bringing together anxieties about the ways in which technology was going in the industrialized West, as well as what was happening in Soviet Russia. So there's no doubt at all, I mean, there are also other stories that he's written which in some ways bring that English experience to bear on what might be going to happen in Russia. So it's a warning about the dangers of industrialization and technology as much as it's a warning about the dangers of totalitarian ideology.
That is just the message and the work that I'm so interested in. I think that there's a lot of publications at the moment. I've got a lot of them within my reach. Hang on, we've got a few there, and then we've got a few here, which are all essentially, hang on, I'll bring them up a little bit closer, all about technology and industry and the dangers of both. And it's certainly a idea that is very familiar to us at the moment, and also that is sort of in a lot of these works. I think there is a tension between the dangers that they're highlighting and then the sort of need for a book to end nicely and not on too down a note. And they tend to end with sort of an idea of education, an idea that we can educate our ways out of it. And I think that's obviously what we hope we can do. But I think that what Zamiatin has to offer is sort of a complementary or the original critique of that.
Yes, because he and Orwell, I mean, both their novels end with the protagonist who has made an attempt to rebel and become independent, essentially being tortured and brainwashed into submission. I mean, it's not a positive. Neither of the stories have a positive ending, and they're very similar in that sort of a muted ending of submission to the authorities.
Are there any other works of Zamiatin's? I've actually never read any of his other books. Are there any in English, and what would you recommend?
Yes, he's a writer with an extraordinary range. Before he started writing books like this, he was actually known as someone who sort of celebrated the quirky, sleepy eccentrics of provincial Russia. Not at all somebody who wrote about it with a modernist eye for the urban environment. But I think of particular interest to an English reader, there's a story called The Islanders, which he did write while he was in Newcastle, and which quite interestingly anticipates some of the themes of the novel We. So that's certainly one that you might enjoy looking at. There are a couple of other stories. There's an extraordinary story called The Flood, which is set in a sort of slightly timeless, possibly Dostoevskian St. Petersburg. And it's Dostoevskian in its preoccupation with murder, and it's somehow the floods which afflict the city, which do afflict the city fairly regularly because it's on a rather exposed position geographically, sort of are tied in with the sort of menstrual cycle of the heroine and her thoughts about murder and blood and childlessness and so on. So it's a rather shocking story as well, quite a violent story, but it's wonderfully written. And he's also a terrific essayist. I mean, there are plenty of other short stories. There are no other significant novels, really. He writes a whole range of very varied short stories, but also some rather wonderful essays, very colourful essays. I think my favourite one is about, it's essentially, the title is, I haven't got the title immediately in my head, about my wives, Russia and icebreakers, that kind of thing.
Love it. Where should I go next? To Bulgakov? Do you know, because I know that a lot of your work is actually about Mikhail Bulgakov.
Bulgakov, he's called.
I'll just stop now.
No, it's just, it's Russian words each have a particular stress, but you can't know it as a foreigner, so there's no way you can guess, and it's completely reasonable to call him Bulgakov, but as it happens, the Russians call him Bulgakov, so that's all.
What was his relationship with Zamiatin, and if you also wanted to talk a little bit about your work you do on Bulgakov, please do.
Well, they became good friends. Zamiatin actually, who's at least his senior as a writer and a little bit older, spotted Bulgakov early on and celebrated him as a sort of new voice in the early 1920s. But they had a lot in common. Biographically, they both came from families of priests. They both were marvelous satirical writers. They both wrote plays as well as prose. And they really liked drinking together and playing poker and whatever. In fact, their lives ran in parallel for a certain time. They both tried to get out of the Soviet Union at the same time. Bulgakov was not allowed was not given permission by Stalin to leave. We do mean Stalin. I mean, it's literally Stalin himself is asked by Maxim Gorky whether these two people may leave, and one of them gets a yes and the other gets a no. And they sort of stayed in touch. But yes, and Bulgakov, well, I've done two biographies of Bulgakov, because one of them I wrote and published for his centenary, but it was in fact the year the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and assembling the material. It was called "Manuscripts Don't Burn," which is a very famous phrase from his novel, and is an affirmation, obviously, of the enduring power of art to survive, which of course turns out to be true both about Zamiatin's Wye, but also about Bulgakov's text. And he, like Zamiatin, was banned, and his book was also, Master and Margarita was only published a quarter of a century after the author's death. And I wrote a biography in Letters and Diaries because I'd been able to work in archives. And basically, when I was a graduate student working on Bulgakov in the Soviet Union, I was treated as a spy. I was regarded as a spy. And I wasn't allowed into a lot of the archives, and people smuggled bits of information out to me, which I copied out by hand. I had to fake about half the footnotes in my doctorate because I had to say that such and such was in such an archive, but in fact I'd made a copy of somebody else's notes from an archive, but I couldn't possibly say that I was sure. But my examiners agreed it was the only correct thing to do. And at the end of our stay, because the authorities in Moscow were sort of pretty unhappy about us being there poking about, so at the end of our stay, as graduate students under the auspices of the British Council, we were allowed illegally to smuggle 2 kilograms of notes and microfilms out through the diplomatic bag. So actually, when I was doing my research on Bulgakov, I then came home and had to go along to King Charles Street to the Foreign Office and get my plastic bag and take it back to Oxford to write my doctorate. So I had sort of little snippets of information which I put together in for biography in 1991. And then 25 years later, in 2017, I wrote a new biography with a lot more access to the new information that had been published in the meantime. And I've just published a reader's companion to the Master and Margarita that came out at the end of last year, and some other things as well. But Bulgakov is also he's a very original, he's a very unique kind of writer. Master and Margarita is unlike anything else. Fantastical, funny, beautiful, moving, enigmatic, and it's a lovely book which I started to read before I went to university, and it continues to give pleasure, and it's a fun text to teach. Students come through the door saying, "What was that?" Just a good way to start a tutorial or a discussion anyway. So
it took my dad 16 years. I think he started the Master and Margarita, when he was in his 20s, and he only finished it and maybe a few years ago. I'm not sure how old if that works out right chronology. Anyway, it took him a long time to read it, and he was it's an incredibly exciting book, isn't it?
It is a fun book, and anyway. So there was just this extraordinary buzz in the 1920s and into the 1930s before Stalin closed it all down with the terror and repression and socialist realism. But Russian language writing in the 1920s, 1910s, 1920s, and into the 30s was just a ferment of ideas and originality. It's a great period to study. So, although a lot of it ends rather tragically for the individuals concerned, it's a great period to be studying.
Absolutely is, and we can't recommend Zamiatin in particular enough. He lived through an incredible period of history as well. I always sort of am amazed by sort of 1884 to 1937.
Yes.
What a
what a time to have lived and written, and he's had an incredible impact, and yeah, so thank you so much for talking to me, and I'm just so interested in everything that you've said today.
Well, thank you. Really enjoyed it. And I hope you'll go on reading more Russian books.
Oh, absolutely. Bye, everybody.
Bye. It's lovely to talk to you.
Thank you so much for listening to day 5 of Gŵyl Festival. I really hope you enjoyed. Coming up tonight to play us out on a Friday evening is Eleanor Vinyl's mix that we are so lucky that she made for us. So I hope you enjoy it, and please do check it out. She is wonderful and a very talented.
Drugarice I drugovi, prva nevina ploča na svetu. Laboratorija je pripremila nešto specijalno za vas. Nevinost, laboratorija. Sa vama su Peđa Vranešević i Bata Vranešević.